let's start with the truth most people don't want to admit. They remember exactly what they did to you. They remember the conversation. They remember the look in your eyes when their words sliced through you like a blade. They remember the silence after the storm they created. But here's the thing, remembering requires responsibility. And responsibility, that demands growth. And let's be honest, most people don't want to grow. They want to glide through life unharmed, untouched, unquestioned. So what do they do instead? They fake forgetfulness. They act like it never happened. They laugh, they smile, they carry on, like your pain was a moment that evaporated into thin air. But let's call it what it is, a performance, a cover-up, a strategy of emotional avoidance designed to protect their ego, not to honor your experience. Have you ever been in that space where someone hurt you and then came back like nothing happened? Texted you like normal? Saturday across from you at a dinner table, fully at peace, while you sat there fighting the war inside your chest. It's disorienting because it doesn't just hurt, it messes with your mind. You begin questioning everything. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe I'm the problem. But here's what I want you to hear right now. You didn't overreact. You responded to a line that was crossed. And just because they pretend it didn't happen doesn't make it any less real. There's a word for what they're doing: emotional evasion. And it's one of the most damaging forms of manipulation we experience because it forces you to carry the emotional labor they're not willing to hold. See, here's the truth. People who don't know how to process guilt don't respond with remorse. They respond with silence, with deflection, with disappearing acts and denial. Because if they admitted to the harm, if they looked you in the eye and said, yes, I did that, they'd have to face a version of themselves they've been running from their whole life. And that's the part they fear more than your pain. So instead of stepping into maturity, they retreat into avoidance. They build a wall between your hurt and their comfort. And guess who they ask to help build that wall? You. They want you to stay quiet, to smile through the pain, to stay in their life and pretend everything is fine. But let me say this clearly. You don't owe anyone your silence to preserve their comfort. You don't owe anyone your confusion just because they can't handle clarity. You don't owe anyone your peace so they can avoid the mirror. You are not needy for wanting closure. You are not too much for remembering what they'd rather erase. You are not weak for hoping they would care enough to acknowledge what they did. But here's where your power begins. It is not your job to drag someone into emotional adulthood. It is not your role to perform your pain louder in hopes that maybe, just maybe, they'll finally hear it. Because the apology you never got, it's not a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their limitations. Let that sink in. You're not unlovable. You're not too sensitive. You're just speaking the language of emotional maturity to someone who only speaks denial. So what do you do now? You stop waiting. You stop explaining. You stop twisting yourself into knots trying to get someone to care. You start healing. You start walking forward, not with bitterness, not with vengeance, but with clarity, because clarity is power. You stop looking back for something that was never going to come. You stop performing the same pain on repeat for an audience that only watches to protect their comfort. The ones who pretend like nothing happened after they've hurt you, they're not forgetful. They're just unwilling to sit in the discomfort that accountability demands, unwilling to look at themselves in the mirror and see the truth, unwilling to do the inner work required to repair, to grow, to change. So instead of saying, I was wrong, they say nothing. Instead of offering repair, they offer distraction. Instead of holding your heart with care, they ask you to pretend it was never bruised. But I need you to hear this. You don't heal by pretending. You heal by telling yourself the truth, even when no one else will. You heal by refusing to stay quiet in order to be accepted. You heal by holding your pain with compassion, not shame, because here's the final truth I'll leave you with in this section. When someone acts like nothing happened, they're not ignoring your pain. They're running from their accountability. And it's not your job to chase them. It's your job to choose yourself. to move forward without apology, to protect your peace, like it's sacred, because at Island. So let me ask you something. How many times have you confused someone else's silence with peace when it was really manipulation in disguise? If this message spoke to something buried deep inside you, I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments. You, like this video, if it woke something up in you, ACA. And don't forget to subscribe. This journey of emotional clarity and personal transformation is just getting started. Thank you for walking this path with me. Let's continue together. Let me ask you something uncomfortable. Have you ever looked into the eyes of the person who hurt you and saw nothing? No guilt, no shame, no recognition of what they did, just normal. Like your pain was a ghost passing through them unnoticed. And in that moment, didn't it feel like you were the crazy one? Like maybe you imagined the whole thing? Like maybe you were being too sensitive? That's the illusion. The performance, they act normal while you're still bleeding. And that disconnection, that emotional gap, it can leave you questioning your reality. But I want to bring you back to truth. They're not acting normal because they're innocent. They're acting normal because pretending is easier than accountability. Because if they acknowledge your pain, they'd have to acknowledge their role in it. And that scares them. Because when you don't have the tools to hold emotional weight, you run, you mask, you fake peace. See, for them, silence is not absence. It's strategy. Pretending everything's fine is not ignorance. It's self-preservation. They build a narrative that keeps them safe. They tell themselves, I didn't mean to. They're just sensitive. It wasn't that bad. Because if they stop long enough to feel what they've done, the whole illusion of who they are crumbles. And that's the deepest fear for people who are addicted to comfort. They fear being wrong. They fear being exposed. They fear having to grow. So they take the easier road. They smile. They post. They laugh with friends. They reply to your message 2 weeks late with a hey 2CO, as if nothing ever happened. And while they're doing that, you're sitting with the echo of every word that broke you, every shift in energy, every moment of betrayal. You remember, you feel it in your chest, in your body, in the pit of your stomach. They act normal because their priority is peace, but only their own. They act normal because your pain disrupts their comfort. And that's what it comes down to. They're protecting their comfort over your healing. Let me say something that might sting. It was never about what they did. It was always about what they were willing to do after. And they chose comfort. They chose denial. They chose move on over let's repair. And I know you keep replaying it in your head. What did I miss? Maybe I didn't explain it well enough. Maybe if I say it differently, they'll finally get it. But deep down, they got it the first time. They saw the tears. They saw the change in your energy. They saw the distance you created to protect yourself. They just didn't care enough to do the hard work of emotional repair. Not because you didn't matter, but because repair requires vulnerability, humility, effort, and that's a currency they're not willing to spend. So they rewrite the story. They say, you were dramatic. They tell people, we just drifted apart. They post as if they're thriving because social media is the perfect stage to perform a lie. And you're left in the wings holding the truth. And that truth feels like a heavy weight on your chest. Because it's not just about being hurt, it's about being erased. Erased from the story, erased from the memory, erased from the reality they chose to construct. But let me remind you, you were there. You felt it. You know what happened. And your pain is not invalid just because someone else can't carry the truth of it. So why do they act normal while you're still bleeding? Because acting normal helps them survive their shame. Because if they can perform normalcy, maybe they don't have to change. Because silence keeps the mirror far away. And once that mirror comes close, once they have to look at themselves, they know they'll be shattered by the reflection. And the truth is, many people are terrified of their reflection. They're terrified of seeing their own selfishness, their cowardice, their unwillingness to grow. So they'd rather keep smiling keep texting, keep pretending, and leave you holding the pieces. That's why it hurts so deeply. Not just because of what they did, but because of what they refused to do afterward. See, growth requires grit, healing requires humility, accountability requires courage, and they've traded all of that for performance. Let me give you a metaphor. Imagine you've just been hit by a car, you're on the ground, bleeding, confused, in pain, and the driver gets out, looks at you, and then says, "You're fine," before driving away, leaving you on the pavement, pretending it never happened. That's what it feels like when someone emotionally wounds you and then acts like everything's normal. That's not love. That's abandonment dressed in indifference. But here's what you must understand. It's not your job to prove your injury. It's not your job to scream louder, cry harder, collapse further just to make someone care. You don't need their acknowledgement to heal. You need your own validation, your own truth, your own boundaries. They may walk around like they're clean, but you and I both know they're walking with blood on their hands, and pretending it's paint won't wash it off. You're allowed to heal in your own time. You're allowed to say, that did happen. You're allowed to grieve the apology you'll never receive. And most importantly, you're allowed to stop hoping they'll change. Because if someone can hurt you, watch you bleed, and still act like everything's fine, they've already shown you who they are. Believe them. Let's talk about a tactic that doesn't leave bruises. It doesn't shout. It doesn't slam doors. It doesn't write angry messages or start fights. It's silence. Not peaceful silence. Not the kind you experience in nature. Not the kind that heals. This silence is loud, deafening, strategic. It's the kind that leaves you second guessing your reality. The kind that speaks volumes in what it refuses to say. The kind that's used as a weapon, not because the other person is speechless, but because silence gives them power. You've been there, haven't you? They hurt you. They crossed a line. They abandoned you emotionally. And instead of engaging, they disappear. They ghost you. They go silent. They act like you're the one who overreacted just by feeling the weight of what they did. You send a message. They read it, but don't respond. You bring it up in conversation. They change the subject. And now you're the one pacing. You're the one explaining. You're the one trying to fill the void with reasons, closure, logic, anything. That's the weapon. Because silence doesn't feel like abuse, but it is manipulation. It doesn't scream, but it shames. It doesn't accuse, but it condemns. It makes you feel like you're the unstable one, like your pain is too loud, your feelings too heavy, your boundaries too much. But I want you to understand something right now. Their silence is not proof of your madness. It's a mirror of their emotional immaturity. Let's break this down. When someone uses silence as avoidance, they're saying, I don't want to take responsibility. I don't want to have a hard conversation. I don't want to be accountable, so I'm going to vanish and make you doubt yourself instead. This is what I call emotional outsourcing. They hand you the guilt they should be holding. They give you the confusion they created. They make you the problem so they can walk away looking clean. It's the emotional equivalent of setting a house on fire and then pretending the smoke doesn't smell. They don't just ignore you. They erase the incident, the pain, the weight, and then they walk around acting like peacekeepers while you're stuck inhaling the ash of everything that went unsaid. Let me be real with you. That silence is not neutral. It's not someone being calm or mature. It's control. It's punishment. It's a psychological power play. Because when they say nothing, you start saying everything. You start replaying what you said, how you said it, wondering where it all went wrong. You write and rewrite messages in your head. You lower your expectations. You shrink your voice. You question your memory. And that's the point. Their silence makes your clarity feel like chaos. Your instincts become a courtroom where you're the defendant and the judge. You lose track of what actually happened because all you're left with is their absence. But silence doesn't erase damage. It magnifies it. It delays it. It lets the wound fester. And here's what's even more heartbreaking. When silence lasts long enough, it convinces you that you don't deserve answers. That's what I need you to reject. You don't have to earn closure from someone who refused to offer honesty. You don't have to shrink just because someone else decided to disappear. You don't have to fill in the blanks with shame. You were always worthy of a conversation, of being heard, of being seen. And silence doesn't change that truth. Now let's go deeper. Why did they choose silence? Because silence keeps them in control. Because if they responded, they'd have to explain, they'd have to apologize, they'd have to get uncomfortable. And for some people, avoiding discomfort is their religion. They've built an entire identity around being good, harmless, the victim, and acknowledging your pain would threaten that narrative. So instead, they go silent. They pick peace over truth, image over integrity, control over connection. Because the moment they speak, they unravel the illusion they've created. The illusion that they're the calm one, the rational one, the innocent one. And you become the storm in their story, just for asking for closure. So what do you do when silence is used against you? When it's not stillness, but a scream disguised as nothing, you stop chasing, you stop begging for acknowledgement, you stop over-explaining, you stop waiting for someone to grow into the maturity you've already earned. Instead, you turn inward. You reclaim your voice. You validate your own pain. You start saying to yourself, I know what happened. I know what I felt. And I refuse to let someone else's silence define my healing. Because here's the thing, your healing doesn't require their response. It requires your commitment to the truth, to your emotional reality, to your growth. You stop holding your breath, waiting for a reply, and start breathing again for yourself. You realize that sometimes the silence you're handed is your invitation to speak louder to yourself, to reclaim your power, to move forward without pretending, because silence used as a weapon will only break you if you let it. But once you see it for what it is, once you name it, once you stop dancing with it, you set yourself free. Not because they changed, but because you did. You stopped seeking closure from someone who doesn't even give themselves clarity. You stopped handing over your peace just because someone else is afraid of truth. You stopped treating silence as a mystery and started seeing it as a mirror. So here's what I want you to remember. Silence can't silence you unless you let it. Their silence isn't power. It's a confession, a silent admission that they're not ready to be who you need. And that's okay. Not because it didn't hurt, but because now you finally see what it island. And when you see clearly, you no longer beg, chase, or shrink. You rise, you speak, you leave, you heal. Let's get honest. Emotional avoidance is not just about silence. It's not just about walking away. It's about self-protection at the cost of someone else's pain. It's about rewriting the story so they don't have to feel uncomfortable. And here's the truth most people don't want to admit. Avoidance is easier than accountability. That's why so many people choose it. They'll lie to themselves before they ever apologize to you. They'll build a wall so high, so dense, so fortified with blame, deflection, and distraction, all to avoid one moment of vulnerability. They don't run from you. They run from what being honest would require of them. And it's important you know this. You are not the reason they avoid. Your hurt didn't cause their retreat. Your truth didn't push them away. Their avoidance isn't about your character, it's about their capacity. They avoid because facing what they did would mean breaking the illusion they've lived inside. The illusion that they're a good person. The illusion that they never mess up. The illusion that their intentions should erase their impact. Let me repeat that because it's critical. They think their intentions are more important than their impact. But here's what you've learned the hard way. Intentions don't heal wounds. Accountability does. And avoidance? Avoidance is the escape route for those who fear their own reflection. Now, you might be asking, why is this so common? Why do so many people choose avoidance over growth? because emotional honesty is painful. It requires stillness. It requires depth. It requires sitting with guilt, shame, and regret. And most people were never taught how to survive those feelings. So they run, not with their feet, but with their stories. They distort, they minimize, they disappear. They'll say things like, I didn't know I hurt you. You're being too sensitive. You took it the wrong way. But behind those statements is one message. I can't afford to feel what I've done. And when someone can't afford to feel, they shut down, not because they're cold, but because they've made emotional comfort their God. They worship peace, but only their own. And your truth threatens that peace. Your experience challenges their narrative. Your pain asks them to dig deeper than they've ever had to go. So instead of leaning in, they lean away, not to find clarity, but to maintain control. Let's take this deeper. Avoidance isn't just an action. It's a belief system. It's the belief that if I ignore it long enough, it will go away. If I distract myself, it will dissolve. If I don't talk about it, it won't matter. But what they fail to realize is that avoidance doesn't erase pain, it transfers it. It turns a moment of healing into a legacy of confusion. Because while they're out there avoiding, you're in here absorbing. You're the one lying awake. You're the one carrying the silence like a weight. You're the one piecing together a puzzle they scattered and walked away from. And that's the injustice of it. You didn't ask for this wound. You didn't volunteer to carry the emotional burden, but you're left with the responsibility of healing anyway. And I want to tell you something with love and clarity. You don't need their permission to heal. You don't need their explanation to let go. You don't need their presence to find peace. Because the truth is, they're not confused. They're just unwilling to say, yes, I did that. Unwilling to sit in the discomfort of growth. Unwilling to take the hard road that leads to transformation. Avoidance is seductive because it feels like relief. But what they don't realize is relief without responsibility is just delay. And delay, that turns into damage. Not just for you, but for them too. Because every time they avoid, they weaken. They get further from their own truth. They shrink the capacity of their relationships. They build castles of isolation, fortresses built on fear. Because if they avoid you, they avoid themselves. And no amount of distractions, vacations, surface level friendships, or curated Instagram stories will protect them from what their soul knows deep down. They hurt someone and they refuse to make it right. But here's what I want to give you. You don't have to carry their emotional debt. You don't have to hold space for their delayed accountability. You don't have to wait at the altar of closure that will never arrive. Your healing is not a group project, and you are not broken because they avoided you. You are whole right now because you faced what they ran from. You had the courage to feel. You had the strength to speak. You had the depth to care. That's not weakness. That's maturity. That's integrity. And they may not meet you there, but that's not your loss. It's theirs, because avoiding the truth may protect them today, but it will cost them tomorrow. When trust fades, when relationships fracture, when people stop believing in the illusion, avoidance will no longer be enough, and they'll have to face what they ran from. Without you, without your guidance, without your voice softening their reality. You tried, you showed up, you told the truth, and now you release, not because they apologized, but because you deserve peace, real peace, the kind that doesn't depend on their growth, the kind that doesn't wait for their clarity, the kind that's built on your decision to heal with or without them. There's a powerful emotion that can heal relationships, restore integrity, and open the door to growth. It's not love. It's not even empathy. It's guilt. But here's the catch. Guilt is only healing when it's embraced. When it's denied, avoided, or distorted, guilt becomes a toxin, not to the person who was hurt, but to the one who caused the harm. Let's go straight into the truth. most people don't know how to hold guilt, so they run from it. And when they do, they become dangerous because now their entire emotional system is built around avoiding accountability, not because they're evil, but because guilt threatens the story they've told themselves about who they are. See, guilt is supposed to be a compass. It's the part of us that says, wait, I messed up. Let me make it right. It's conscience. It's correction. It's the sacred discomfort that tells us you can do better. You need to repair this. But for someone who doesn't know how to process guilt, it doesn't land as guidance. It lands as shame, as personal failure, as ego death. So what do? They armor up, they deny, they blame, they go silent. They flip the story and make you the villain. Not because your pain was invalid, but because your pain triggered their guilt, and their guilt is unbearable. I want to pause right here and make something clear to you. You're not being too sensitive. You're not making it all about you. You're not asking for too much by needing repair. What's actually happening is this. You're requesting accountability from someone who sees guilt as a threat instead of a guide. And when guilt becomes their enemy, you become their target. Let's break this down even further. Most people associate guilt with condemnation. Maybe they grew up in homes where guilt led to punishment instead of learning where being wrong meant being unloved, where mistakes were met with rejection instead of redirection. So now, as adults, they avoid guilt at all costs. They've never learned how to say, I was wrong. Because to them, that sounds like, I am bad. And when someone's self-worth is fragile, admitting fault feels like destruction. They don't have the inner scaffolding to separate behavior from identity. So instead of holding their guilt with humility, they attack you with defensiveness. They'll say things like, you're always starting drama. You're just trying to make me feel guilty. You're too emotional. And just like that, your legitimate pain becomes their weapon of deflection. Why? Because if they acknowledge how deeply they hurt you, they'd have to confront a truth. They've spent years avoiding that they caused harm, that they failed someone they claim to care about, that their choices, whether intentional or not, left wounds behind. And instead of sitting with that truth, they run because running feels safer than reflecting. Let me ask you something. Have you ever tried to express your hurt to someone and they responded like you were attacking them? You were calm. You were clear. You just wanted to be heard. And suddenly, you're in a full-blown emotional battlefield you never asked for. That's not because your delivery was wrong. It's because guilt hijacked their nervous system. They went into defense mode. And now, instead of healing, you're stuck managing their emotional explosion. This is how guilt becomes the enemy. Not because guilt is wrong, but because they never learned how to walk through it. They've built an identity that depends on being the good guy, the caring friend, the loyal partner, the misunderstood victim, and guilt shatters that identity. So they rewrite the story. You didn't get hurt. You misunderstood. You weren't betrayed. You were too needy. You didn't express pain. You created drama. And this is where things get twisted, because now you start questioning yourself. You start shrinking. You start managing their reaction more than you honor your own truth. But hear me clearly. You are not responsible for someone else's guilt tolerance. You are not responsible for shrinking your pain to protect their ego. You are not responsible for making someone feel comfortable with the truth they refuse to face. You've probably said to yourself, if they just felt a little of what I felt, they'd understand. If they just opened their heart, they'd care. But emotional maturity doesn't come from exposure to pain. It comes from a willingness to process it, to sit with it, to learn from it. And not everyone's willing because growth is expensive. It costs comfort. It costs pride. It costs control. And some people would rather go bankrupt emotionally than pay the price of transformation. So they push guilt away. And in doing so, they push you away too, because your presence reminds them of the work they haven't done. Your honesty reminds them of the version of themselves they refuse to confront. And your integrity highlights the gaps in their character they've spent years ignoring. So instead of growing, they blame. Instead of reflecting, they retreat. Instead of apologizing, they rewrite the past. That's how guilt becomes their enemy. And if you're not careful, you'll make the mistake of thinking their avoidance means you were wrong. But let me tell you something powerful. Your pain was the evidence. Their guilt was the confession. Their avoidance was the verdict. You never needed anything more than that to validate what you went through. So where does that leave you? Not in bitterness, not in revenge, but in clarity. You now know they weren't ready to be accountable. They weren't capable of holding guilt with grace. They weren't willing to walk the path of repair. And that's not your failure. That's their limit. Let's talk about the apology that never came. The one you rehearsed for in your head. The one you hoped would show up in your inbox. The one you waited for. Through silence, through distance, through every overthinking night. Let's call it what it is. It hurts. It hurts when someone breaks something inside you and walks away as if it never cracked. It hurts when someone shatters trust and then acts like your healing is your problem. It hurts when you're holding emotional rubble in your hands and they're already on to their next chapter. And the worst part, you start to believe maybe you were the one who expected too much. Maybe you were too sensitive. Maybe you should have been quieter, cooler, easier. But no, let's clear that up right now. You didn't get the apology, not because you were too much, but because they were not enough. Not enough to be humble. Not enough to take ownership. Not enough to grow. You weren't denied an apology because your pain wasn't valid. You were denied because their capacity stopped where accountability began. And yes, that kind of rejection cuts deep because we've been taught to believe that apologies equal justice, that when someone hurts us, the mature human thing to do is to say, I see what I did. I'm sorry. How can I make it right? But here's the brutal truth. Not everyone has the emotional maturity to offer that. Some people will do the damage and then let you do the cleanup. Some will act like their silence is peace. Some will convince themselves that time is healing, when really time is just hiding the mess they left behind. You carry the memory, the ache, the questions, while they carry on. So what do you do when you've been denied closure? When the apology never comes? When you realize they'll never say the words you needed to hear? You do something radical. You stop waiting. You stop waiting for someone else's conscience to wake up. You stop waiting for a message that may never arrive. You stop outsourcing your healing to someone who couldn't even offer you honesty. And instead, you choose yourself. You choose peace over replaying the pain. You choose truth over the illusion. You choose forward over backward. Because let's be honest, what would their apology actually change? Would it undo the betrayal? Would it erase the sleepless nights? Would it make the version of you that got hurt magically whole again? Maybe not, because healing doesn't come from them. It comes from you. You heal when you stop expecting them to become someone they never showed you. You heal when you stop explaining your pain to people who've already proven they don't want to understand it. You heal when you realize an apology is a bonus, not a requirement. Yes, it would have been nice. Yes, it would have brought ease. But don't confuse their silence with your worth. Don't confuse their inaction with the value of your experience. What they didn't say does not invalidate what you felt. Your emotions don't need to be mirrored to be real. Your pain doesn't need to be acknowledged to be healed. Your truth doesn't need applause to matter. You've already survived the hardest part. You felt it. You carried it. And you're still here. That strength, that's yours. They don't get credit for it. They don't get to walk away and define how you heal. You do. But let me offer you something gentle here. You're allowed to grieve the apology you never got. You're allowed to be angry, to feel the injustice, to sit in the ache of what should have been. Because forgiveness doesn't mean pretending you're fine. It means releasing the hope that the past could have been different. It means saying, this hurt me, and they never tried to make it right. But I will not carry this into my future. I will not let the absence of an apology become the absence of my peace. So, how do you move forward when someone refuses to take responsibility? You give yourself what they couldn't. You give yourself the words, the closure, the care. You look in the mirror and say, I'm sorry you were made to feel small. I'm sorry they chose silence when you needed truth. I'm sorry your love was met with avoidance, but I will not abandon you the way they did. You write the letter they never sent. You give yourself the conversation they weren't brave enough to have. You create the ending they were too careless to provide, not to fix what happened, but to reclaim your power from it. Because when you no longer need an apology to move forward, you become free. And that's what this moment is about. Not revenge, not bitterness, not even getting justice. It's about liberation. It's about realizing that waiting for someone to become emotionally honest is a cage you were never meant to live in. It's about walking out of that emotional prison, even if the door has always been open, and finally realizing you don't need them to say sorry to know you deserved better. You did. You always did. And now your future begins with the clarity of that truth. So if you're still holding on to the apology, to the hope, to the question of why didn't they care enough to make it right, I want you to ask yourself this. Why am I letting someone's lack of accountability hold my growth hostage? Because they've already made their choice. Now it's your turn. Let them keep the silence. Let them keep the performance. Let them live in their comfort. You rise, not because it didn't hurt, but because you finally understand they may never give you closure, but you can always give it to yourself. Let's talk about something that most of us aren't taught growing up. Closure is a gift, not a guarantee. We've been conditioned to believe that healing only begins once we get the apology, once they come back and finally admit what they did, once they say, I was wrong, I'm sorry, I see your pain. But the deeper truth, some people will never say it. Some people will never own it. Some people will never return to the mess they made. Not because they've moved on, but because they're afraid to look back. And that's where your real power begins. When you stop waiting for someone else to close the door and you realize you can close it yourself. This isn't about pretending it didn't hurt. It did. It cracked something inside you. It made you question things you never should have had to. It shook your trust in them, in yourself, in what love or loyalty or friendship was supposed to mean. But there's a moment quiet, steady, and sacred where you no longer chase understanding. You no longer chase them. You no longer rehearse what you'd say if they finally listened. Instead, you pose, you breathe, and you say something radically freeing. I may never get closure, but I still choose wholeness. Wholeness is when you stop looking for answers in the mouth of someone who silenced you. Wholeness is when you stop trying to find peace in a heart that caused you war. Wholeness is when you give yourself what they never could: validation, compassion, clarity, and care. See, closure is external. It comes from them. But wholeness, that comes from within. And it's not loud. It's not flashy. It doesn't always come with a dramatic goodbye or a final confrontation. Sometimes wholeness is quiet. Sometimes it looks like not replying, not justifying, not needing to explain the wound anymore, not waiting for their version of the truth. Sometimes wholeness is just walking away and not looking back. Let me share something with you. You don't heal by reopening the same conversation with someone who refuses to evolve. You don't heal by handing over your peace to someone who never protected it. You don't heal by getting dragged back into a loop that was never meant to complete. Healing happens when you choose yourself, even when it's lonely, even when the world tells you to talk it out, even when you're surrounded by noise, opinions, or memories that beg for resolution. You rise when you say, I don't need them to see what I know is true. I don't need their permission to release what they'll never carry. I don't need their voice to hear my own. Because the most painful realization isn't that they didn't care. It's that you waited so long to care for yourself. And I get it. You held on because you believed in what the connection used to be. You believed people could change. You believed that maybe, just maybe, your pain mattered enough for them to step up. But there's a moment where belief must be replaced by boundaries, and where loyalty to them must transform into loyalty to yourself. It's not cold. It's not cruel. It's clarity. It's saying, I will no longer allow someone's inability to apologize to define the way I heal. I will no longer let their silence become the loudest voice in my head. I will no longer put my growth on pause, waiting for someone who pressed play on their life without me. That's what Wholeness Island. It's reclaiming your timeline. It's stepping out of the waiting room of someone else's emotional development. It's not needing a ribbon-tied ending to honor what you went through. You are not unfinished. You are not broken without their sorry. You are not lost because they never circled back. You are the author now. And the new chapter begins when you stop rereading the one they left blank. So here's what I want to leave you with. Not a motivational slogan, not a feel-good quote, but a truth that will anchor you long after this conversation ends. Your wholeness is not conditional. It doesn't depend on who returns. It doesn't depend on what's resolved. It doesn't even depend on whether they ever understood what they did. Wholeness begins when you stop giving the keys to your healing to someone who locked the door and walked away. And in that moment, you realize something sacred. You don't need closure to close the chapter. You just need courage. Courage to trust your memory. Courage to validate your own pain. Courage to walk toward your future, even if you're still limping from the past. That's what you deserve. That's what you've always deserved. So today, let this be your silent ceremony. No applause. No audience. No dramatic ending. Just you. Choosing peace. Choosing power. Choosing wholeness over closure. Because the most powerful people in this world are not the ones who get the apology, but the ones who heal anyway. And now, that's you.